Today I'm going to be telling you a little bit about the history of knitting while knitting. Specifically, I'm going to talk about the earliest evidence of knitting that we have and how knitting began to spread in its early days. Before knitting existed, there was a fiber craft called Nile Bending. This craft was more like sewing than knitting or crochet. The tool for Nile Bending looks a lot like a sewing needle. We have evidence of this craft dating back to the 3rd or 5th century. Some believe that this craft was a stepping stone in the development of knitting as we know it today. This is an example of a piece made with Nile Bending. These socks are from Egypt and have an interesting split around the toe area. I couldn't find any specific information on why they have this split, but I have a theory that it was so that the socks could be worn with sandals, which would have been the most common shoe type in that era. The earliest piece of knitting made with 2 needles was found in North Africa and was made around the year 1100. One thing I find so interesting about this is that one of the first pieces of knitting evidence that we have is a colorwork piece. The work on this sock is intricate and beautiful. It's clear that knitting was a reasonably established and understood craft by the time this artifact was made. It was clearly made by a talented artisan. The pattern of this sock is similar to patterns found in many Islamic ceramics that would have been popular at the time and in the area. Now, knitting did eventually leave Africa, and it spread to Europe when Spanish royal families began to employ knitters to create various items, including cushions, gloves, and other garments and accessories. Some of these artifacts were found in tombs that date back to the year 1275. Knitting became more widespread and standard by the 14th century, with knitted items being seen as everyday goods. It became so widespread that it was even featured in paintings, including this one, Madonna Knitting by Bertram Minden, from the early 1400s. I remember the first time I saw this painting, I was so confused why Mary was holding 4 needles. I had never seen that in knitting before, and I thought it was a strange medieval craft rather than the kind of knitting I was aware of. Now, I regularly knit with 4 double-pointed needles in the round, much like Mary in this painting. Interestingly, there seemed to be a gap in European knitting knowledge. There was evidence of purling in early Egyptian knitting, but none in early European knitting. The purl stitch did not reappear in European knitting until the 16th century, and it seems like purling and yarn overs, which are a lace technique, seem to appear around the same time. It's really interesting to think about the fact that for nearly 2 centuries, all of the knitting made in Europe would have been garter stitch only, because they did not know how to purl. Over time, more techniques developed in different parts of the world, and knitted items became an important staple in nearly every household across Europe. Of course, there's a lot more history to knitting than just what I talked about here today, but I think this is a nice snapshot into how knitting got its start. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed this little bit of knitting history. If you're curious what I'm working on, the yarn I'm using is Sirdar Jewel Spun with Wool Chunky in the colorway Sea Glass on 8mm needles. By the time this video is going out, this project will be done, and this beanie and more just like it will be for sale on my Etsy store, if you'd like to purchase them. Thank you again for watching, and I hope you enjoyed. I'll see you next time.